Hey party people, what's happening? It's Therese, your immortal host, friend, confidant. And today I'm going to talk to you about something very, very exciting. I even broke out the good stuff to have a little chat with you because we're going to have a night of it. We're going to do a night. We're going to hang out. What am I going to talk about? Why am I so excited? Well, today we are going to talk about vampire movies. It's no secret that I like a vampire movie. Of course I do. We like seeing ourselves in cinema. Nothing warms where my heart should be more than when the heroic immortal finally vanquishes the evil human. And you know what? We like stuff that's comforting to us. We like stuff we've seen before. It's like watching your favourite Studio Ghibli film or having Love Island on in the background while you're trying to scramble your dissertation. So sometimes what we've seen before can be comforting and good, which is fine. But innovation doesn't happen when you just repeat the same thing over and over again. And this is kind of what I'm tying in to talk about today. So obviously, as I've said, I love vampire movies. But I noticed something kind of disturbing about 7 years ago. And it was that I was bored. Which is hard to say, okay? It's really hard to say, but I was fucking bored. I could see where the journey was going. I was just so sick of seeing the same thing. Oh my god, I'm bad, I'm gonna hurt you. And then, you know, they fall in love with someone. And then it's just all kind of tiring, kind of old. So today I'm going to talk to you about the death of vampire movies. Gothic horror has been around for hundreds of years. I could go into a very detailed history of it, but I want to keep this video a watchable length. So for the sake of time, I'll just try and be brief. Even if you don't know the term, you've kind of seen this genre before. You've got very dramatic, dark weather, huge decaying mansions or castles that look ancient and frozen in time. You've got
bloody wolves chasing me through some blue inferno.
You know, Gothic horror. The first ever horror film was a Gothic horror. It was called Le Manoir du Diable, which translates to the House of the Devil. And it was this massive spooky castle mansion thing, and it had not technically a vampire, but a big bat that turned into the devil, so we know what it was. Then we had the German Expressionism films. So these weren't labelled horror back then, they were called German Expressionism, but they were things like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu. In fact, a lot of Tim Burton's, you know, overtly Gothic films now are very inspired by German Expressionism. Then Gothic horror really made a resurgence in the 30s in Hollywood. We had Bela Lugosi's Dracula, we had Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So you've probably began to notice that there's something that keeps popping up in Gothic horror, and it's vampires. There's something about them that is so intrinsically linked to the genre, it's hard to have it without them. They just fit together. So after the 30s we took a break, and then in the 50s in the UK we came back with, and we saw all of our old favourites, including Christopher Lee taking on the role of Dracula. In the book British Gothic Cinema, Forshaw writes, the product of Hammer Films was clarion evidence that the Gothic impulse was capable of almost continual reinvention. So the interesting thing about this quote, the Gothic horror genre, even though we've seen some really cool modern Gothic horrors like Crimson Peak and the others, it hasn't really been the one to revive. Although I'm like all about a Gothic horror revival, like I want to see what happened to folk horror in the last decade happened to Gothic horror, like bring it back. But it wasn't the genre that really revived itself. It was the vampires. They were the ones that didn't seem to be able to die. So there was only so long that vampires could cling onto the Gothic horror genre before they outgrew it. And so in about the 70s, 80s, we entered a new period of vampire films, which I like to call the cool vampire period. So in the cool vampire period, we became bad. So we weren't old men hissing at the cross anymore. We were bikers, we were cowboys, we were Kiefer Sutherland in a mullet. Like, we weren't good still, we were still kind of the villains of the story, but you could kind of sympathise with the cause a bit more. There was usually a guy, and he like wasn't as bad as the others. He'd get turned into a vampire, but he was kind of a good guy and he had to like find his way out of it. Movies I'd put into this era are like Near Dark, Fright Night, The Lost Boys, and to an extent from Dusk Till Dawn. It kind of like time-wise bleeds over into the next phase, but there's not really a hard line on these things. It's more like trends rather than eras. So the next stage is what I think is the most interesting in vampiric cinema history, and it's when the cinema began to get way more varied, because vampires were still cool, hard to take that away from us, but we became more human. You had Louis being all self-hating in Interview with a Vampire. You had the innocent vampire that falls in love with a human in Let the Right One In. And in Buffy, you had both with Angel. We had David Boreanaz as a vampire. Suddenly vampires had morals, or at least they knew something was a little bit cursed about them. And it's no coincidence that in this era, the variety of vampire films boomed. You had one-of-a-kind movies, like the comedy mockumentary What We Do in the Shadows, the Western Persian vampire film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and whatever the fuck Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter was. I love that film. I really did like it. It was fun. Like, I never see it on these like lists of like top 50 vampire films of all time. I never see it. It's fucking good. Like, give it a chance, guys. What are you, too good for it?
I shall kill them all.
And this was great. This was great. But there's only one problem when you get this kind of exposure with the genre, and that's oversaturation. So, vampires had always been famous, but thanks to the work of a certain YA teen fantasy novel, they were everywhere. And I got a bit sick of it. You know, this is coming from someone who has to live as a vampire with no respite. Like, if I had to see one more broody, pale, soft boy being like, I'm a monster, I was gonna fucking like what always happens with the trend cycle, when oversaturation occurs, boredom starts to happen. So it wasn't just me that was getting sick of it, everybody was over it. But because there's something so sexy about vampires, it was hard to get rid of. They were big money makers. So unlike previous eras like the 30s and the 50s and the 80s, when eventually it kind of like dropped down, it clung on too long. Maybe like the superhero genre is doing today. Side note, I really want to make a video about the superhero genre, so keep that in your noodle. But they just didn't seem to be running out of steam. Until recently. Like, recently I've noticed a bit of a drop-off with the whole vampire thing. Aside from What We Do in the Shadows TV show, I feel like mostly we've sort of come out of the trend. And like, it kind of felt like we explored vampires in every which way. It felt like we'd run out of the intrigue that kind of brought people to the genre in the first place. You know, the sexiness. It went away because we just knew everything about it. We knew what was gonna happen. People might say, Therese, if vampires have always come and gone in cinema history, then how can you argue that they're gonna die out? Surely they'll just come back again. And I would say this to you. The problem is, when you're mortal, you tend to forget that things have not been around for as long as you think they have. Cinema's only been around for less than 150 years. So maybe vampire movies haven't run out of steam yet, but this could be the death rattle of a long-standing but still temporary trend.
Bloody wolves chasing me through some
Whew, we got a bit real there, didn't we? I know I'm immortal, but everything is finite, and it's bringing it home a little bit too much. So do I think this is actually going to happen? No. This isn't just wishful thinking on my part. This is a cold, calculated thing here. No, I don't think it's going to happen. And the reason is, when you saw the increase in variety of vampire cinema in my whole little history thing, was when we started viewing them as human rather than monsters. Because the thing about humanity is stories are everything. Stories have been told for the entire history of humanity. We still consume more stories than any other era has ever done. We are so media driven. Viewing vampires as another facet of humanity means we can never get sick of them. We can tell them in as infinite a number of ways as stories about humans have been told. The most recent, like, interesting new vampire film I saw was actually Blood Red Sky. So it kind of gives me hope. I think after What We Do in the Shadows, the TV series has been off air for a bit, like maybe for a few years, and we've had a breather from the genre, I feel like people can take the time to come back with more innovative stories. I don't think vampire films are so much a genre as the vampires in them are just a device of storytelling. As I said earlier, a different facet of humanity. And so for that reason, I don't think it'll ever die. My closing argument is you can't get rid of us because we're just like you. I've enjoyed talking to you all, so please subscribe to Late Night Movies so we can do this again. We can have a chat again. It's not always going to be about vampires. It's going to be about various movie shit, usually horror, because I am inclined towards that genre. But let me know what you thought of this. Let me know what you think of Blood Red Sky when you watch it. I think it's pretty cool. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. See ya. Bye. Go on, leave. Go, leave. Go! Go!
To Carfax Abbey.